At dawn in the Libyan desert in the late summer of 1941, the air was so still that sound carried for miles. And yet on more than one morning, Luftwaffe ground crews would find entire rows of their aircraft silently burned out, without ever having heard an engine, a truck, or even a voice in the night. This is one of the less discussed realities of the North African campaign. In the official British Army list of units for September 1941, the Special Air Service technically did not exist. Major David Stirling was forbidden to wear his own unit's name on anything that could be captured. Even cables going back to Cairo HQ were disguised through administrative fiction. The SAS was born in denied language, and anonymity became part of the unit, in both life and death. The struggle was brutal from the beginning. When Stirling first proposed a small raiding force designed to infiltrate deeply, destroy Axis aircraft on the ground, and escape before the enemy even understood what had happened, most British senior officers saw it as suicidal. The doctrinal thinking at that time assumed large unit mass, not tiny teams. But Stirling had observed a single friction point in the war. Rommel's entire desert logistics calculus depended on a fragile lift capacity of German transport aircraft. These airfields, Sirte, Gazala, Tamimi, Benina, were the actual lifelines for Africa Corps maneuver. If a small unconventional unit could destroy aircraft faster than the Axis could replace them, the SAS could shape battles without fighting them conventionally. But operating behind enemy lines in the desert was an entirely separate kind of war. These men used compasses and stars. There was no GPS, no overhead ISR. Petrol had to be rationed by the quarter gallon. Water was life. A single punctured tire in the wrong wadis meant slow death by heat. And so their operations were built on silence, deception, and mobility. No radios on insertion. No headlights. The first SAS quickly learned to move like wind, unseen, unfelt, and then strike with terrifying speed. From Stirling's own handwritten notes, scrawled in pencil on oxidizing field forms, success depends not on equipment, but on nerve. The average man in an SAS stick in 1941 carried as much plastic explosive as water. They used small Lewis bombs, a device Stirling developed with Jock Lewis, essentially a combination of plastic explosive, diesel fuel, and a time pencil detonator. One bomb could kill a bomber. 6 bombs could erase an entire dispersal line of aircraft. A well-organized stick could plant 30 charges in under 10 minutes. When the SAS raided Axis airfields near Sirte and Gazala in late 1941, RAF bomber command records did not reflect the true damage. RAF HQ recorded aircraft destroyed by SAS demolition as likely by airstrikes. This was not a mistake, it was intentional concealment. The SAS was too new, too sensitive, and Stirling feared that if London revealed what the SAS was actually doing, Berlin would adapt faster. So the SAS existed in a double shadow, invisible to friends and enemies. There is something chilling in the Luftwaffe paperwork from this period. The Germans often wrote unknown sabotage agent, even when blasts. Signatures matched Lewis bomb fragmentation. The Axis believed Rommel had a spy problem. They believed some airfield ground crews were betraying them. They could not conceive that 8 to 12 men, moving in modified trucks, had crossed hundreds of miles of desert just to destroy aircraft. That disbelief, that blindness, became the SAS's greatest weapon. Modern Special Forces doctrine, from British Pathfinders to US Delta, still cites Stirling's planning memos: precision action, small footprint, maximum operational effect. The SAS proved that speed, intelligence, and initiative had more strategic weight than massed battalions. But there is also mystery that lingers. Several SAS operators from the earliest Libya period have casualty forms that do not explain where they died or why their bodies were never found. Some were lost in storms. Some likely died in wadis that were later swallowed by shifting dunes. But some were simply never accounted for. Their final operations never logged. Their last positions never radioed. This was a unit that lived inside official denial. And sometimes historical records simply end, mid-sentence. And that unresolved silence sets the stage for the next evolution. The moment when these men take the desert lessons and transform them into motorized lightning. Because when they mounted Vickers K guns on jeeps and attacked Bars at night, they would create the raid that the Luftwaffe would never fully explain. In the fall of 1942, the Libyan night could feel like a black ocean. And somewhere inside that ink-dark expanse, a column of open-topped jeeps would accelerate to full speed without a single lamp lit. Their target, the Bas airfield, an Axis stronghold between coastal Cyrenaica and the mountainous Jebel Akhdar. What followed would become one of the most aggressive, cinematic, and unnervingly precise vehicle-borne sabotage raids ever attempted in WWII. And yet, for decades afterward, the German records describing that night read less like after-action reports and more like disbelief. Even now, military historians still argue over how the SAS got so close, hit so hard, and then vanished so cleanly. The struggle began long before the first shot. In September 1942, David Sterling tasked Captain George Jellicoe's men with a high-risk strike many considered far beyond sustainable range. The British Long-Range Desert Group would provide navigational support, but the SAS would do the actual killing. Their jeeps, stripped of weight and fitted with twin Vickers K guns, were tuned for speed and violence. A kind of desert dragster built for a few minutes of pure shock effect. The plan required a nocturnal sprint of hundreds of kilometers, without headlights, through sand, wadis, and enemy patrol arcs. In the desert, a storm could erase a track in minutes. One wrong bearing could kill the entire force. The SAS didn't just need luck, they needed perfection. A personal note from an SAS trooper, preserved in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, captures that razor edge. "We drove by stars. If the sky had clouded, we would have died in silence." That is not poetic exaggeration. That is physics and geography in North Africa. No landmarks, no villages, no power lines. Just dunes, endless dunes. And across those dunes came this small convoy. In an era before night vision, before GPS, before anything but raw nerve, racing full throttle toward Bas. Historically, the Luftwaffe believed its airstrips were far from Allied reach. They assumed that distance alone was armor. That assumption would die in a single night. Just before midnight, the SAS jeeps breached the perimeter in a staggered attack line, like a scythe slicing through wheat. The men didn't dismount. They fired from the jeeps, moving through aircraft lines like a mobile hurricane of tracer fire. Vickers K guns spat an astonishing rate of fire, over 950 rounds per minute, shredding fuel tanks and igniting aircraft in chained fireballs. Witnesses later said the flames were bright enough to cast shadows off airplane fuselages. A handful of men, in a handful of jeeps, destroyed aircraft numbers usually associated with a squadron-level bombing raid. The reveal is in the aftermath. Because German investigators did not believe their own eyes. In a Luftwaffe damage report later found in Freiburg's Bundesarchive, the phrasing is telling. Attack likely supported by ground element. They suspected internal sabotage. They thought Italian mechanics were complicit. They imagined a traitor network. They struggled to imagine the truth, that maybe 20 men in desert street jeeps had simply driven faster than the Axis believed possible. Even decades later, veterans of the Bas raid described the extraction as the most dangerous moment, because success had immediately triggered a massive response net. Unlike the desert airstrip raids of 1941, this enemy had teeth ready to strike. Axis patrols converged. Italian Carabinieri station logs show frantic searches along the Bas-Marge road. The SAS jeeps had to run cold, engines off, while German trucks roared past only meters away. And here is the mystery that modern researchers still debate: the final Luftwaffe aircraft loss. Numbers remain inconsistent across archives. Different sets of files disagree by margins too large to dismiss as clerical drift. RAF intelligence estimated more than a dozen aircraft destroyed. Some German logs imply more. Other documents are redacted post-war, which raises the question, what exactly was being protected? The raid impact? Or the intelligence source who predicted which aircraft would be present that night? That is where the Bas raid shifts from daring strike to investigative puzzle, because some of those intelligence assessments never appeared in ultra-decrypt chains. They came from somewhere else, possibly a local informant, possibly a covert Italian resistance cell. But that part of the story, that origin, remains an opaque wound in the record. As the flames at Bas faded into smoke and the SAS slipped back into the desert like a bad dream, the war moved toward its next phase: a new theatre, a new coastline, and a new and more complex kind of insertion. Sicily would test secrecy even harder than the desert. In the summer of 1943, the Mediterranean changed colour. not literally, but politically, and in that transition the SAS found a new coastline to haunt. Sicily, a place of stone terraces, lemon groves, bandit folklore, and narrow coastal villages, where a man could disappear simply by stepping into a courtyard. Operation Pistol would not involve jeeps. It would not involve a desert horizon. It would instead demand something colder, quieter, and far more personal. Infiltration by water, insertion by small craft, and destruction of infrastructure while surrounded not by dunes, but by people. The Axis airfields of Cyrenaica were isolated islands of metal and sand, but here, on Sicily, the targets were woven into the civilian landscape of Europe. The struggle took shape in July and August 1943. The Allies had already landed in Operation Husky. The island was in open conflict, and yet, behind that conventional campaign, MI9 and SOE were feeding Sterling's men one specific requirement: rail sabotage. Because in Sicily, the Axis relied on rail to move men, and to move artillery, and to move ammunition from Palermo and Messina toward Catania and the southern battle sectors. If the SAS could sever a handful of rail junctions, even for 36 to 48 hours, they could choke entire brigades of German reinforcement. But this time, the SAS didn't have the desert to hide inside. Instead, they hid inside Sicilian humanity. Night after night, 6 TAS 10-man teams were landed from small fishing boats, often vessels that looked indistinguishable from the boats that had worked these coasts for generations. The men disguised weapons inside tarred nets. Explosive charges were hidden in buckets that would have looked like bait containers from 10 meters away. They moved along narrow mule paths bordered by low stone walls that had stood since before Garibaldi unified Italy. Every sound mattered. On a single hillside at night, even the rustle of a boot could echo like a cough. The insight is preserved in a single memoir fragment, preserved in the National Army Museum, reportedly written by Trooper Harry Poole. "We were not ghosts. We were guests." He then describes a hillside family who did not ask names, but simply offered wine. That is a detail many viewers of war documentaries underestimate. Sicily was not uniformly fascist. Families who had lost uncles to conscription did not rush to warn the Carabinieri about strangers in the night. Silence here was a kind of currency, and that silence allowed Royal Engineers and SAS sappers to set time pencils and det cord on steel rails that had carried Axis guns the day before. A single cut rail line can be repaired quickly, 90 minutes sometimes, but destroy a rail junction, especially a multi-line crossing, and the repair clock explodes. Operation Pistol targeted junctions, and what is fascinating in the German documentation is that they never describe the perpetrators as enemy commandos. In multiple Carabinieri garrison logs near Randazzo, the phrasing used is unknown demolition agents. In one document, an Italian captain speculates that these saboteurs may have been escaped Allied prisoners living in the hills. They simply did not envision a fully organized Allied unit moving through their villages with such casual invisibility. The reveal that still haunts historians is that some of the SS teams were never visually confirmed returning to Allied lines. That is not myth. That is recorded fact. In the Imperial War Museum's casualty index cards, a handful of SAS troopers assigned to Pistol are recorded as missing, presumed. But those cards do not list confirmed KIA coordinates, and those names never appeared in German POW lists. To this day, their exact fate is unknown, possibly capture and secret execution, possibly killed in firefights too small to generate paperwork, possibly buried in unmarked Sicilian farm plots in 1943 and never recovered. Those small absences, those blank lines, become the mystery that defines this phase of SAS history. Modern reflection. Special operations instructors still cite Operation Pistol as a case study in austere infiltration because the SAS conducted sabotage inside a densely populated environment without drawing attention not merely from the enemy, but from civilians. It is one thing to infiltrate a desert. It is another to infiltrate a living island. And so the Sicilian coastline, quiet now, still contains stories unresolved. By late August, the SAS was preparing to shift north again. The war was changing shape. The Allies were pushing into mainland Italy. But the next chapter, one that would define the SAS in the European continent, was already forming across the Channel. France, and the Normandy aftermath, would bring the SAS into direct clash with elite German armoured divisions, and in French woodland, the lines between partisan, commando, and spy would blur even further. In June of 1944, the forests of central France became a hunting ground, not for deer or boar, but for men, and one particular German after-action entry, attributed to elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, reads with a kind of frustration that historians still pause on. Unknown light forces disrupt roads, strength impossible to estimate, activity inconsistent with reported Allied airborne numbers. That line is not an exaggeration. It is an admission, because what the SS could not comprehend, at least not immediately, was that fewer than 200 SAS men, operating in shirt sleeves, often in civilian jackets, armed with Stens, Piats, and a few Vickers guns, were influencing the movement speed of a frontline armoured division, and the SS did not want to write those words down. Hounsworth, June to August 1944, was the moment the SAS transitioned from desert raiders to continental ghosts. The struggle begins with context. After the D-Day landings on the 6th of June 1944, Germany needed fresh armoured units to push toward Normandy, fast. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, a formation with a brutal combat record on the Eastern Front, was attempting to move north from the Toulouse region, and yet month after month it didn't arrive on schedule. Allied planners understood this movement delay as a critical strategic advantage, because every hour the SS was stuck in central France was an hour the Allies could dig in, reinforce, and expand their beachhead. The SAS, working with SOE networks and French Maquis cells, were tasked to create friction, to complicate every logistic assumption the German command had built. Hounsworth was not a single mission. It was a sustained campaign of pinpricks, outages, and disruptions. Captain Patrick Garstin's SAS men parachuted into Morvan Massif in the night, forming concealed woodland camps. They used Sten guns suppressed by the forest floor. They fired Piat rounds at German trucks on small country roads, then disappeared so completely that German junior officers assumed they were chasing an entire brigade. The SAS understood a principle that modern insurgency textbooks still teach. The enemy's uncertainty is sometimes more valuable than the enemy's casualties. A single diary, page, attributed to Trooper Ken Batchelor, that gives a visceral insight into the lived reality. We fight without front lines. Our front line is the next hedge, the next bend. There was no desert horizon here. Visibility shrank to tree trunks and brambles. A German patrol could appear 20 feet away without warning. The risk profile changed. Close-quarter firefights, short bursts, then immediate scatter. The reveal, the mystery, is not in how the Germans reacted tactically, but in how they reacted intellectually. Surviving German war diaries depict wildly inaccurate Allied force estimates. Some entries speak of hundreds of enemy in the hills. Others describe parachute battalions. The SS believed they were facing a major foreign battle group. They never fully understood that most engagements involved less than a platoon. The misperception was so strong that even post-war, Bundeswehr historical reviewers have admitted that these assessments appear operationally hysterical. But there is another layer the documentary audience should not overlook. The SAS were not merely raiding, they were shaping population psychology. French civilians, farmers, innkeepers, woodcutters, saw British and Free French soldiers in the woods. They saw German trucks burning on lanes where, only yesterday, Panzer Grenadiers bullied them. Silence became complicity, but also protection. SAS camps received eggs, bread, sometimes even wine, without conversation. There is no paperwork for such transactions, no receipts, just a recognition that liberation was now physically walking through the hedgerows. To this day, some RAF Special Duties flight logs associated with Hounsworth drop zones contain partial redactions. Some MI5 post-mission summary sheets omit the exact identity of French contacts who guided SAS teams between safe houses, not because the acts were illegal, but because the families involved may have remained at risk into the early Cold War. Oral historians have repeatedly run into the same wall, names that are still not spoken, even in the 21st century. The legacy impact? Modern NATO Special Operations Doctrine cites Hounsworth as a template for partnership operations. Small teams, local collaboration, high-value disruption. The SAS didn't win a battle. They won hours, and those hours shaped a campaign. As the guns in Normandy thundered and Allied beachheads turned into beachheads no longer, the SAS's role shifted, again to an even more dangerous assignment, one where the line between sabotage and martyrdom would blur violently, because what came next, in the Vosges, was not merely a raid, it was a trap. In August 1944, the forested Vosges mountains east of the Moselle became a place where maps stopped being useful, because suddenly, Allied operators were no longer hiding inside wilderness to strike and slip away. They were hiding simply to survive. Operation Leuthen began with confidence. It ended with vanishing. It is one of the bleakest, most unnerving SAS operations of the war, and one of the most poorly understood, because the paperwork we do have is riddled with gaps, redacted references, and casualty lists that don't line up. What we do know is this: Leuthen was intended to support the rumoured rising of the Maquis and prepare the ground for the US Third Army's approach. But geography moved and intelligence did not. American columns that were expected to break eastward stalled, and the SAS teams, already deep inside German-held territory, found themselves effectively alone. The struggle crystallized by the third week of August. Major Roy Ferran and his SAS squadrons had dropped into the Vosges Plateau, establishing hide sites around Mousset, La Bresse, and the dense fir stands that blanketed the ridgelines. The men carried stens and pistols, plastic explosive for bridge work, and piats for unexpected road ambushes. Their insertion was not under fire. Quite the opposite. The drop was clean, unrecovered. And that, ironically, is what made the situation so deadly. The Germans had no confirmed location at the start, but the longer the SAS stayed without extraction, the closer the net drew. Leuthen was a time bomb whose timer never stopped ticking. Farron made a fatal assumption, that Patton's armoured spearheads would arrive in the region in days, maybe a week. But the American drive paused to consolidate supply echelons west of the Vosges. Meanwhile, the SAS began burning through rations meant for half the duration. One preserved SAS notebook page, held in the UK National Archives, contains a line underlined twice: "Use less ammo, use less light." That note says everything. This was not a raid, this had become a siege. From the German perimeter inward. The insight becomes darker when we examine German reporting. Units of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen, and security battalions in the region had already been hunting for Allied parachutists. But by late August, they had a clue. An intercepted courier bag near Mousset revealed coded references to British units in the hills. And from that moment, the Germans hunted with obsession. They did not intend to capture in order to interrogate. They intended to capture in order to annihilate. Under the Führerbefehl, the Commando Order of 1942, a standing criminal directive, Allied raiders captured behind lines were to be shot, not processed as POWs. The reveal, the part that chills the blood, is not just that the SAS men were captured. It is that, in several cases, they were not even kept long enough for formal field questioning. Multiple SAS troopers were executed and buried in unmarked ground. Some bodies were later recovered by war crimes investigators in 1946. Some were never identified with certainty. The estimates vary, but roughly 30 men associated with Leuthen never returned. Yet their last known positions are not pinned to a single grid reference. Leuthen's casualty trail is smeared across woodland, ravine, hamlet, and culvert, and the mystery deepens at Mousset, a mountain village whose inhabitants refused to identify the SAS to German investigators, even after arrests began. That act of refusal would cost the town dearly. German reprisals swept up dozens of civilians. Several villagers were deported to camps, where many never returned. Their testimony, the ones who survived, remains controlled, careful. Some spoke in the 1960s to BBC researchers, but not everything was said on tape. Some details were spoken only in kitchens and never repeated for record. To modern special operations professionals, Leuthen is not a tactical study. It is a cautionary one. It is about the danger of overconfidence toward assumed relief forces. It is about what happens when ground truth outpaces planning assumptions. But to the historian and the archivist, Leuthen is something more. It is the point where the SAS intersects pure archival absence. Names are missing, index cards are incomplete, bodies are missing locations. This is why historians speak of Leuthen not as a raid, but as a wound. By mid-September, the Germans considered the area cleared, and yet even that phrase, cleared, is unsteady, because somewhere inside the larger Leuthen picture lies a deeper, unresolved uncertainty. How many SAS men escaped through the forests and were sheltered in silence, never formally reported until liberation? The number is non-zero, but the files don't agree on which of those men were lost or late returnees. And as the front moved east towards Strasbourg, and autumn light began to drain earlier each day, the SAS prepared for the final chapters of the European War, chapters written in a strangely bureaucratic tone, because the last story of the SAS and WWII is not tactical. It is archival, it is redaction. In the closing winter of the European War, the story of the SAS shifts tone from kinetic violence to something colder. Paperwork. Paperwork written in pencil, typed on carbon paper, stamped twice, then later, partly erased, because even when the gunfire stopped, the information war kept burning, and the record of the SAS, the official institutional memory of what these small teams had done, went into a long corridor of locked files, misfiled reports, and in some cases, deliberately anonymous references to other units. The final mystery of the SAS in WWII is not in the desert or the Sicilian hills or the Vosges ravines. It is in Whitehall vaults. It is in the gaps. The struggle in this last phase wasn't an enemy ambush, or an SS cordon, or a race through a desert wadi. It was the simple, suffocating friction of bureaucracy. Because after 1945, the post-war British military system was trying to categorize a force that had never fit into categories in the first place. The SAS was not a brigade. It was not a regiment in the conventional sense. It was not airborne infantry, not pathfinders, not long-range recce. It had been invented in war, and then, as so many unconventional units are, it was threatened with dissolution once peace returned. The Treasury asked for budget clarifications. The War Office asked for justification. And in those questions, the SAS's paper trail began to be reshaped, trimmed, flattened. The insight that historians wrestle with is this: MI5 and SOE, in multiple verified instances, edited SAS after-action reports before they were even archived. We know this because some draft versions survive. In reading rooms today, researchers scroll through microfilm where one page has 3 names. The next page is the same narrative, but with those names gone. The code numbers remain X9, M2, but the identities do not. A line once reading, operated WT set using local French liaison, becomes unknown partisan element. The reason is foundational to how intelligence policy works. In 1946, nobody knew when the next war would begin, and nobody had the guarantee that French villagers who hid SAS men in Hounsworth or Leuthen would not someday be under threat again. From Germans, from collaborators, from communists, from the new Cold War shape. So anonymity, the cloak carried in the desert, persisted in the archive. There is a reveal in this. Some of the best SAS work in WWII was intentionally uncredited. An entire lineage of sabotage, methodology, Lewis bombs, Vickers K Jeep tactics, the art of vanishing before attribution was taught to other branches, and those branches inherited the credit while the SAS file was simply marked advice provided. The men who had spent nights navigating by stars and maps, held flat against boots under blackout camouflage, are often missing from the paperwork after 1945. Names, clipped away not for secrecy against the enemy, but secrecy against future, political risk and diplomatic vulnerability, and there remains one question, the one that documentary. Viewers always arrive at eventually. How many aircraft, rail cars, trains, tank columns, depot stacks did the SAS actually destroy? Official numbers vary, not gently, but dramatically. In some RAF summaries, Axis aircraft destroyed in North Africa between late 41 and early 42 are listed as 50 or 60% unknown origin. In some German tabulations, the BAS raid loss count exists in banded totals rather than discrete numbers, indicating internal argument even within the Luftwaffe's paperwork. Some Sicilian demolition effects attributed to unknown saboteurs now map directly to SAS mission manifests, but the British side never updated the totals. And Leuthen? Even the casualty table, the simplest table in war, does not line up in a single neat column to a modern analytical mind, especially intelligence. Officers trained on digital ISR and hard telemetry, these gaps look like sloppiness, but that misunderstands the era. 941, to 1944 Special Operations lived on silence. It used absence as a weapon, and therefore, absence is what it left behind. Modern Special Operations Command schools in multiple NATO states cite this exact era. Not as an operational template. Tech has moved. Doctrine has evolved. But as a philosophical root, influence is not always visible and not always credited. And sometimes, the dead are unnamed not because their story was forgotten, but because it was protected. So the last page of the SAS in WWII is not a victory parade. It is a closed file drawer. A handful of pages, some erased, some missing, some never written, and somewhere between desert night, Sicilian cliffs, French hedgerow, and Vosges pine, the hardest detail to reconstruct is not what the SAS did. It is what the SAS chose not to let the world record. Because that, in the end, was their final operational act.